Okay, so in the previous video, we looked at creating a report. The first thing you'll probably notice is that the report is not over here. A couple reasons for that. I actually filmed that previous tutorial months ago, something like 6 months ago or 7 months ago. So I suspect what happened is I didn't actually save the report at the end of the tutorial, and so it was deleted or lost when my PC did a restart with a Windows update. I'm not sure. It really doesn't matter because the bottom line is, even though you should watch the previous tutorial to get the basics, you don't actually need that report. We're going to create a whole new report from scratch, so you don't actually need that report. It's good to understand the concepts, but you don't need the actual object. So, what I said in the previous tutorial was that the report was directly linked to a table. So everything in the table would go into a report. Well, if that table is big, that's going to be a problem. Maybe you don't want that. Maybe by default you want a range, a very narrow range. Now, there's certain maintenance you can do to tables, like for instance, maybe you have a transaction table and you purge all the information from the table every day. So it gets archived and now the table is empty. And so by default, the table refreshes every day or every week or every month. There's nothing wrong with that, but now you're doing a lot of maintenance to the table. Maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you don't want to mess with the table itself. Maybe what you want to do is you want to create an intermediary. So you have your table, you have your report, you want to put something in between it. And I mentioned that in the previous video. You can create a query. And so the query will do filtering based on the criteria that you enter, and then the report will only show that criteria. What you could also then do is add yet another object. You can create a form, and I'm sure you've seen this in the workplace where you say, okay, I want to run a report, but you have to choose certain parameters. Maybe you have to choose a value from a drop-down box or put a radio button or whatever. But the bottom line is you're interacting with essentially a form. That form then transfers that information to the query. The query then filters the table, and then it filters the information coming from the table, and then the information that gets put into the report is based on what you put into the form. We'll probably eventually go that far. That will probably be an additional tutorial. This one is just meant to introduce the idea of the query, and the query, or not just the query, but how the query can affect what's in a form, can affect what's in a report, excuse me. And then in the next video, we can then look at adding the extra layer of a form. And ideally, I mean, yes, you and I will see the query because we're developing it, but ideally the query, as well as the table, is hidden from the end user. If you've been watching this series from the beginning, that's one thing that I mentioned is that ultimately, this is it's not meant to look like a database to the end user. They see only what they need. They see the form, they see the report, whatever. But they don't actually see all the underlying objects, and you hide those things away from them. So let's let's open the table. And there's really nothing great here to base the query on. I mean, we could do a transaction amount, but we already did that with the conditional formatting. So let's do something different. Let's go to design view and just add a whole new field. Let's call it canceled. So maybe the transaction has been canceled. And you could say, well, why would it even be here? There may be legal ramifications. You may have to, and I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but you might have to legally keep a record of transactions even if it's canceled. Don't know. But for your own auditing purposes, you're probably going to want to have a track of even canceled orders. So there is a yes or no, but honestly, I really don't like the way yes or no works. I'm not sure about 2016, but in 2010, the Access 2010, it did really odd things like the values were 0, -1, and so you had to check by that numerical value rather than the word yes or no or Y or N, but it's not worth the hassle. So even if they fixed it, you can easily create your own yes or no, and you can actually customize it. In my opinion, you're better off just creating your own yes or no value. And here's how it works. You go to Lookup Wizard. You got two choices. One is to grab the value from a table. You'd probably do that if it's a value that keeps changing. or it's a very large table that you don't have to manually enter, like you're pulling it from city and state or something like that. In this case, there's only two choices. There's two choices as far as yes or no. There's two choices here. That's not what I meant. I meant that there's only two choices, yes or no. So you can just manually type this in. I will type in the values that I want. So again, if it's a list that's going to keep changing, you don't want to type it in. You want to take it from a table, you make the update to the table, and it cascades to everywhere that utilizes it. But this, it's just two values, so we're just going to type it in ourselves. Next. Y and N. Next. Do you want to limit entries to the choice? If something like this, if it doesn't say do not, then by checking this, you're enabling this. Well, in this case, you're enabling a limitation. So you got to be very careful with the checkboxes. Sometimes you're checking a positive, sometimes you're checking a negative. So in this case, you're saying limit the list. Yes, we want to limit the list. In other words, you just created a yes or no. You don't want people to be able to type maybe. You want it to be restricted to the list you just created. Here, it's the opposite. Allow multiple values. This is something you're enabling. Well, no, we don't want multiple values. We want them to only choose yes or choose no. So, where would you choose multiple values? I'm not sure why you'd track it, but maybe ethnicity. If someone comes from a couple different backgrounds, like they're Polish and Irish, and that you want to acknowledge that they have both those ethnicities. I don't know. There's other things you could track that would be that are not mutually exclusive. Yes and no are mutually exclusive. You could track something that is not mutually exclusive. And then finish. So we'll save this. Go to view. Now watch what happens. I click here. Now if I try typing something, it technically lets me type, but then it gives an error message and says you can't do that. So here you go. Yes or no? Yes. No. Yes. Yes. No. 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 And I try avoiding patterns when I'm entering data just to make sure that I'm not accidentally getting what I'm looking for, that it truly is indeed the right results. And that's also why you don't want to have just one or two values. You want to have multiple values, or multiple rows, I should say. Okay, so we entered our values. So far, not much. So we will close this. If you notice, it didn't ask you to save. I think I've mentioned this before. When it prompts you to save, it's not saving the data that you stored in the table. It's saving structural changes to the table itself. So as soon as you enter a value, if you exit, you move into a different cell, that's it. That value has now been saved and the old value has been lost. The only time you can retrieve a value is if you type a value into a cell, you have not moved out of the cell. If you hit escape, it resets just that cell. If you hit escape 20 more times, it does not reset 20 more cells. You can only reset the cell you're in. The other cell have indeed been changed. Okay, so we've modified our table with something that we're going to use as criteria. So let's go ahead and now create that query. So we're going to go to query design. And as I said, you can use this. I find it just clutters the screen. So I close it, take table, drag and drop it. Now you can use the asterisk, and I think I mentioned this before. If you choose this, if you add more fields, kind of like we just did, they will show up in the query. Okay. The problem with that is if this report gets sent to someone, okay, so there's something downstream of you, if they're automatically importing it, having an extra table could cause an error and not integrate correctly. So even though this sounds like a great idea, you've got to be very careful. If there's anything downstream of you and they're automatically importing tables, it could create an error. So it's your judgment what you do, but I'm going to just manually select these. Now, our two choices are yes, or Y and N. So we're just going to put in Y. So there's our query. So let's go ahead and run it. And as you can see, it brought up the ones that have yes, or again, Y, really not yes. Now let's save this, and we'll call this user prefs for user preferences, and we'll also throw on QRY for query. Almost there. So we're going to create blank report, go to design view, click on the top here. Sorry, I was clicking on the wrong square. I was clicking on page headings rather than the actual report as a whole. Go to data, record source, and see we're not going to use table. We're going to use that query. Let's go to design, add existing field. We're going to bring transaction date, customer name, and some of the concepts that I mentioned before. Anything that's in the detail section gets repeated for every single row. So you're going to want to move the labels out. But I just want to test this functionality. I want you to see this working. So yes, you're going to have repeats, but like I said, that's just the layout portion, and I'm not going to contribute a lot of time to that. Devil's in the details. You could be doing that all night long or longer. Okay. And let's just move this over. Even this, which was supposed to be just a quick drag and drop, is now stretching out a few minutes, so you could really get lost in the layout. Okay, so now here's the thing. If a report is very specifically showing that something is canceled or not canceled, okay, then do you really need that value there? That's your choice. Because if you name the report canceled transaction report, do you really want every single value to say canceled? You can if you want. Again, that is, I suppose you can use that to make sure that it's truly working, but just be mindful of who's going to see this. And now, like I said, this space, what you're seeing, unlike a form, this is getting repeated for every single row. So you want to shrink this up. Let's view it. Okay, so it's only showing the canceled ones. Let's go back to design. Let's save this. Let's call this, I'm not going to call it canceled report, because like I said, the query is really user preferences, and eventually we're going to add a form that lets you change the preferences. So let's just call this user prefs underscore RPT. And naming convention is important. You'll know that these two relate to each other. So let's close this. Now don't double click on the query. You want to right click and choose design. If you double click, you're running it. And if it's a really big query, might as well go get a cup of coffee or hot chocolate while it's running. So yeah, if you want to modify it, don't double click on it. You want to right click. So that was yes. So let's now do no. Save it. Close it. Again, double click. Well, first time that we're double clicking on the report because we didn't have it saved. And now it's only showing the no's. So now you have successfully integrated a query with a report. So rather than having a table directly feed into a report, you're now having that table be filtered by the query and then having the query go into the report. And like I said, this is the basis of now building out user preferences. So someone will have a form. It's like, what do you want to see on the report? I want to see everything that's not canceled. I want to see everything from a certain transaction amount. I want to see everything with a certain name on it. Maybe if there was a salesperson associated with this, maybe you want the salesperson name as well. So in the next video, we will look at that. We're going to look at probably adding a couple more fields to the table. And then, like I said, the next component or the next object is going to be a form that a person makes a few settings on a form. The form communicates to the query, and then the report opens up. So again, the query, the table, that's going to be invisible to the end user. They're just going to see the report and the form. And just to give you a little preview, what's going to happen is right now you have what's known as a constant. You are looking for exactly the same value 100% of the time. You can actually bake into this. So if you right click, you choose build, you can now select various components of the database and come up with a calculation. I don't want to get really into that because, like I said, that's really the next tutorial. The next tutorial is designing the form and showing how the form feeds into this query. So rather than having constants, the form is going to feed values into this, and then the report will then be affected accordingly. So I'm going to break here, think of what I want for additional fields here that would make sense for a report, and then we'll pick it from there. So if you have any questions, just let me know.